This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. We'll get to those stories in a few, but first let's start with our top story. When the 2022 World Cup was first announced in Qatar, it left a number of people scratching their heads. And not just because of the surprising choice in the host, tournament organizers also made quite the claim about the upcoming games and their impact on the planet.
The unconvincing claims from FIFA and the World Cup's host, Qatar, both insisting this year's tournament will be carbon neutral.
In its bid, the country promised to make it a carbon neutral tournament.
The CO2 emissions during the 28 days will be offset by investing in carbon credits.
While the stadiums themselves may have energy-efficient architecture, the emissions from flying in supplies for construction and then flying in all the staff and fans creates a total emissions cost that's greater than their original estimates. FIFA's own report suggests it will be even higher than for the Russian World Cup. Across the globe, from private corporations to state governments, we've seen countless pledges to become carbon neutral or pledges to reach net zero on all emissions. Right here in the US, after rejoining the Paris Agreement, the US pledged to reach net zero by 2050. It's such a crucial part of our climate pledges, so it's worth taking some time to ask, what does it actually mean for organizations to claim to be carbon neutral? And why might some lofty claims be met with such skepticism? When a group is carbon neutral, that means it's taking steps to remove an amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that's equivalent to what's being emitted by that group's activities. Net zero just refers to all harmful emissions, not just carbon dioxide. That can be achieved by buying carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are projects that remove harmful gases in the air, like projects that convert systems to renewable energy or preserve forests that absorb greenhouse gases. But they're tricky to verify they're doing what they say they're doing, specifically what's known as additionality. Additionality works like this. If a company pays a landowner not to cut down their forests, it can be hard to prove the landowner was going to cut down the forests in the first place. If the trees were always going to be preserved anyway, then that company isn't actually adding anything to the carbon removal process, and thus, they're not truly offsetting the emissions they're creating. The strategy in Qatar for the World Cup relies on carbon offsets too, for example, though critics point out that organizers are verifying their own offsets. Last year, the offset market reached almost $1 billion in valuation for the first time. Yet, the market is still largely unregulated across the globe, which opens the door for some questionable claims of additionality. A 2020 investigation from Bloomberg found some pretty big names running into the additionality problem. JP Morgan Chase, Disney, and BlackRock each paid different municipalities to preserve forest land in Pennsylvania and New York in deals up to $1 million. In all of these cases, Bloomberg found the land was never threatened in the first place, and the forests were on protected land. In these cases, the companies were working with a middleman, an organization known as the Nature Conservancy, which recruits the landowners or puts its own properties toward carbon offset properties. The company insisted their offset projects are validated by third-party auditors, though in 2021, they launched an internal review of its own projects. But it's not just the Nature Conservancy that's run into trouble. One 2019 investigation found that forest preservation projects had overwhelmingly failed to offset the amount of pollution they were supposed to.
There's no other jurisdiction in the world. Think about that. That's doing what the state of California is doing.
Even in one of the state's most friendly to aggressive green policies, studies have shown California's forest carbon offset program likely overstated its emission reductions by as much as 80%, and it looks equally grim abroad. An EU Commission study from 2016 found that 85% of national offset projects were unlikely to have been additional. Some experts note that while certain carbon offsets are not ideal, they might just be a necessary piece of the puzzle in reaching climate goals. But the lack of oversight and regulation in the offsets market leads to big questions about the most effective way to reduce emissions and how to keep polluters from just buying themselves a cover. It's not all doom and gloom though. Some major organizations are finding industry-wide solutions that could address the problem more directly. For example, the airliner EasyJet recently announced it will no longer use carbon offsetting but will invest further in developing low-carbon tech for all aviation. Microsoft pivoted in 2020 to only investing in carbon capture technologies, like those used by the company Climeworks. Together with Salesforce, Microsoft pledged $300 million for tech that removes emissions from the air directly. Their goal isn't carbon neutral, but carbon negative. Carbon emissions are not going away anytime soon, and carbon offsets are a difficult solution to rely on. But finding creative ways to limit emissions at the source, and even remove them entirely, could be a game-changing approach we need to fight climate change. The UN's COP27 summit on climate ended earlier this month, but it might have skirted under your radar thanks to the midterms and, well, that big soccer tournament we keep talking about. The summit led to one major decision that deserves some attention: the Loss and Damage Fund. Our UN correspondent in New York, Will Denslow, breaks down how the massive deal took place and what this historic international fund is for.
The COP27 climate summit had to go into overtime to get the Loss and Damage Fund deal secured. COP27 was supposed to conclude on Friday, the 18th of November. It wasn't until the Sunday morning in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where delegates were able to get this deal secured. We heard from Pakistan's climate change minister describing it as historic. Of course, Pakistan has been hit so hard by flooding this year. The minister saying this wasn't about poorer developing nations from accepting charity, instead describing it as a down payment to help invest in these nations' futures. Of course, the whole purpose of the Loss and Damage Fund is to really help provide financial support for developing nations to help them rebuild and recover after being impacted by extreme weather events. We've heard from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who heralded this deal but was keen to add that this, in his mind, is only a first step.
I welcome the decision to establish a loss and damage fund and to operationalize it in the coming period. Clearly, this will not be enough, but it is a much-needed political signal to rebuild broken trust. The voices of those on the front lines of the climate crisis must be heard.
A major sticking point during the negotiations at COP27 were on whether nations still regarded as developing, like China, should be donors to this fund. However, a compromise was eventually found, meaning that the door is open to voluntary contributions. One thing the deal did do is acknowledge that there are serious financial shortcomings when it comes to providing financial assistance for those poor nations hit so hard by the impacts of climate change. There were, though, a number of questions still yet to be answered as to how this fund and how the funding mechanism would really work. The hope is, though, that this deal will now establish a mechanism to try and answer some of those questions by the time COP28 comes around in the UAE next November. One thing that is very clear from the UN, they believe that some of the poorest nations have been hit disproportionately hard by the impacts of the climate crisis, even though many of them have been the smallest contributors to it. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this fund is the first step towards addressing that injustice. William Denslow for Newsy, New York.